Okay, so in this final section, we just wanted to talk about our experience and work of trying to both translate and to adapt a particular cognitive screening tool, which is the Addenbrooks, which you've heard a lot about already. So it was interesting, the comment you made earlier about needing new tests. So when we... it's the... Yeah, so... I mean, I think when we think about the need for tests, and when you realise that you may not have a test suitable for what you want to assess, and maybe there's a test where you think is available somewhere else, you could think about what do we do? So, well, maybe we just use the same test. Maybe you just translate the instructions, but that often is not going to be suitable. So sometimes then what's required is both the translation and the adaptation of the test. So we need to adapt the test, and that may be appropriate. Sometimes you may want to change, you're going to develop something which is very closely in the same test family. So you construct a test in the new language that follows the same design and the principles or the paradigm of the model test, the test that you're perhaps following, but with substantially new and culturally relevant content and procedures. Or you could switch to thinking about developing what you might call an indigenous test version. So where you construct a test in the target language or cultural context with substantially new design and principles and culturally relevant content and procedures, but with the intention of measuring the same construct, so closely following the same construct from perhaps an original test. Or finally, you might simply say, right, let's start completely from scratch and say we're going to construct a test in a target language or cultural context with a substantially new design and principles and culturally relevant content and procedures, and perhaps with thinking about a different or a new construct. So all these things are available. But if you decide that you're going to think about translating and adapting a test, well, actually, we have some guidelines available to guide you through that process. So the International Test Commission, the ITC, developed a set of 18 guidelines that were aimed to try and ensure a robust and rigorous approach to translating or adapting new tests. And they're divided into all these different sections. And over the last few years, a group of us, as part of the International Neuropsychology Society, developed a neuropsychological application of the ITC guidelines for translating and adapting tests. So the original ITC guidelines are sort of generic and quite broad, and often are written in a way that perhaps is more for questionnaires or more general psychometric tests. And we wanted to think about, well, if we were going to use this test for neuropsychological tests, how would we use them? So in a way, I'm just going to give you a quick summary there. You can go to that paper, you can have a look at the details of that. But in a way, maybe it takes us through this process. We might go through this process. So first off, the first thing to do when you're thinking about, I need a test. There's a test over there. I could use that. Stop and think. What is it I'm actually trying to measure? And will this test do what I want it to do? Does a translation or even an adaptation make sense? Sometimes it doesn't. And then you say, well, okay, let's start from scratch and perhaps develop an indigenous version or an indigenous measure. Well, okay, let's say, well, yes, I hope so. I think this test might work. Well, we're going to obtain the necessary permissions. We're going to consider the construct and items and their relevance in the new context. We're going to think about the cultural and linguistic difficulties that might influence performance that are not relevant to what we're examining and try to minimize them. We're going to work with linguistic and construct experts to clarify what can be translated and what needs adapting to ensure that the test is going to assess the construct as you intended. We're going to think about the administration context and the instructions that may be specific to the new context. Orientation to test taking, clarifying the role of the neuropsychologist, establishing rapport and interactional style, and providing clear instructions. We're going to reduce substantial pilot testing, and anyone that's been involved in translating or adapting tests will tell you pilot test. Don't just dive into a big study, collect all your normative data at the beginning. Do some pilot testing, because you'll find things that don't work, and you have to further adapt them. And then you're going to look at reliability and validity studies with representative samples. So consider carefully the population that you want to be using your test with. Does the sample that you're going to assess or demonstrate your validity and your reliability with include people of a similar age, sex, education, language use, acculturation, socioeconomic status, and so on? And if you're interpreting or comparing group-level performances between cultural contexts, which we're usually not really trying to do, a wide variety of cultural characteristics needed to be considered. But in general, we're not really interested in cross-cultural comparisons. We're just interested in whether the test works in the new context. And then we're going to write a good, detailed manual to help people administer it. So those are the principles of the process, and often a lengthy and detailed process of test adaptation. So let me just talk through briefly the process that we did with the Bengali adaptation of the ACE. So as you know, I'm going to skip this. Well, just make the point that the ACE, as we know, has been used in many languages. But one of the things that our partner noted early on in starting to use, beginning to use the Hindi or Telugu versions, that there were items on those, even though they were items that were naming items that were in a sense adapted for the Indian context, some of the items were not working with Bengali speakers. So the process of thinking about translation and adaptation began. So with getting permissions, and then thinking about that expert review process. So what needs to be translated and culturally adapted? And as we say, this is hard to see the detail on here. But this was a whole process of things like an initial forward translation, then an expert review of those translations, thinking about the items that need changing and adapting, making some modifications. And this is just to the instructions here. This is to the instructions and the administration guidelines. And so giving an example in terms of the one thing that came out was in terms of delivering the phonemic fluency and adding an extra instruction with regard to adding vowels to form the letters. I won't try and pronounce them, but just in a sense tweaking the instruction to make it more appropriate for the context rather than sticking to the original phonemic fluency instructions. So then getting into the items, the actual content, the material of the test. And what I'm concentrating on here is just as the naming test as an example of this, and I'll mention a couple of other things, but here in the naming test, because that's often the one that's causes the most problems. So a pre-pilot phase and then a formal pilot phase. So the work began by looking at what were the items that were used in the existing version. So looking at the original ACE, the ACE 3 in English, and then two of the existing Indian versions. So collecting together the items that sort of spanned across those versions. So what were the main items? So there were 25 items there. And then, in fact, across the versions, there were different images used for different items. So a crown, or in terms of the goat, and so on. So 10 of those items actually had more than one representation across multiple versions. So then, looking at asking a sample of participants, of healthy participants, which picture most closely resembled their mental image of the object, just to sort of think about which picture to use, and then picking out the most representative items from those. So then looking in another sample of healthy participants, so 74 healthy participants, looking at the extent to which people produced the name, in a sense, were they giving the apparently correct name, in a sense, but to what extent was the name that people gave in agreement with the general convention of naming, but also to what extent people gave a rating of how familiar was that item. How familiar in sort of everyday exposure was that item? And so we ended up with, in a sense, categorizing the existing items, into those that were rated as high familiarity or lower familiarity, and then where there was high name agreement, and then a lower name agreement. So one of the things that we were trying to do, I suppose, was to identify items that may be more sensitive to impairment. So if you have a test that's just full of very easy, so high familiarity, high name agreement, very easy items, then the chances are it will be less sensitive. But of course, if you include items that healthy controls just hardly anybody gets correct, then again, that test is not going to be much use to you. So there were 13 outliers, either because they were absolutely everybody got these items correct, or where there was a very low level of responding. So that left with 12 items, these ones down here, 12 items that could be split into those. Again, we were looking for living items and non-living items, and then these different levels of familiarity and name agreement. So then the decision was, well, perhaps it would be worth thinking about some additional items, some new items, and some, again, additional culturally relevant items. So took another set of 14 items, and then did the same process. So looked at which items were high familiarity, high name agreement, and so on. There were a couple of items that then got excluded, so the lantern and the boat as sort of outliers, but 12 items left in. So then we have 24 items in total, so 12 from the original sets or the original existing versions of the test, and then 12 new items. So we had a set of 24. So then there was a process of collecting, again, additional data. So this time with a group of people with healthy controls, people with MCI, and people with AD and vascular dementia. And in this, what we're doing is we're giving that test to those groups, and then looking at, in a sense, item analysis. So look at individual items and looking at item difficulty, but then also item discrimination. So in item discrimination, there are two approaches to that. One is what's called the corrected item total correlation. So that's where you look at the correlation between each individual item and then the total score, excluding that item. And then a discrimination index. So it's DU minus DL. So where DU is the number of participants in the upper 25th percentile with correct response as a proportion of the number of participants in that upper 25th percentile. And then DL is the number of participants in the lower 25th percentile with correct responses as a proportion of the number of participants in that lower 25th. So what you're trying to look at is which items might be most sensitive to different levels of performance across the group, if you like, or across the groups. So I end up with a big scale like this. Again, you can't read that so easily. But what we've got, this is all of the 24 items down here. So this is the item difficulty. So this is the sort of name, how likely people got it correct in a sense. This is a rating of the level of difficulty, and these are this is the level of discrimination. So we can rank order these items, if you like, in based on the sort of level of discrimination and difficulty, and the two forms of level of discrimination. So we rank ordered them on here, and then we end up with a combined rank. So the combined rank, in a sense, should be those items that seem to be best at discriminating, in a sense, between being good at the test and being bad at the test, if you like. And so we end up with a final set of 12 items, which are designed to be the most sensitive to difficulties with naming. And there's some easy items and some moderate items. The overall discrimination indices of the items are all excellent, and then with a Cronbach's alpha internal consistency of 0.76. That's one example, I suppose, of just, in a sense, trying to be really thorough in that approach to examining and adapting a test to make sure that it works in the new context in which you want to do it, in this case with Bengali speakers. Other examples were some modifications to scoring. So here we've modified the items, but then we also may be wanting to modify the scoring process again to reflect how people will perform, and in a way that ensures that you're detecting difficulties or impairments as a result of a dementia, rather than just, and so what would be more normal performance in the context. So that include both adjustments to the scoring for phonemic and animal fluency, and then some adjustments to scoring of the clock drawing test as well. So for a given example at the bottom there, you could score correctly if clock numbers were written partly in English script and partly in Bengali. That's acceptable because that's a common performance. If you stuck to, in a sense, scoring people down because they mix their numbers, then that's going to be, you're going to reduce the sensitivity of your test. So you're trying to look at how to maximize the sensitivity and specificity of the test. So this, again, tricky to see, but just gives an overall flavor of the variety of the process, in a sense, and the items that were changed along the way. So, in a sense, I guess what we were trying to say here is illustrate that we felt that drawing on those ITC guidelines is really helpful in ensuring that the ACE3 was adapted in a way that's likely to make it most appropriate to the linguistic and cultural context in which it was intended to be used. And we encourage you, in a sense, to be thinking about that. It's a demanding process, it's challenging. But similarly, I go back to the point we were raising at the beginning of the conversation we had. In a sense, in this context, this adaptation, which was lengthy and worked, and I think we feel, and we've, in terms of looking at the validation of that test, we know that it works well. But it could have been at the beginning. We say, well, actually, we should start from scratch, and we should think, what is it we want to assess? What is it we're trying to assess? And I think when we're thinking about broader range of neuropsychological tests, I think in thinking about what construct, if you think about executive functions and thinking about attention and concentration, all those different things, a starting point is often to think, what is it we want to assess in the people that we see? What is it? How does dementia? How does stroke? How does that manifest in the people that we're seeing most commonly? And do we have a test that assesses that? Now you may end up back where lots of people in different parts of the world have arrived, and that's fine. But I think doing that thinking, I think, is an important thing. And then just a final note, and then I'll finish. In a sense, we've emphasised, of course, the thinking about the norm. So in these cognitive, particularly the cognitive screens, the temptation is to have, in a sense, a single cutoff for everybody. You're above it or you're below it. But the problem is that only works, in a sense, if these tests are relatively insensitive to things like age or sex or education. And the problem for here, in a sense, is that people have a wide range of education, and we know that education influences test performance. So here's just to illustrate, this is a group of healthy controls on this Adam-Brooks test, so the Adam-Brooks. So going from people with very low levels of education, so hardly any or one year of education, through to people with 20 plus years of education. And what you see is if you just do a correlation, this is 305 healthy people, and if you look at the correlation between education and ACE-R total, in people who are healthy, the correlation is 0.8. That's a huge correlation. And what you see is, in a sense, we have this virtually sort of straight line here up until around sort of 10 years of education, and then it flattens out, as we might expect. So in somewhere like the UK, in a sense, we're only seeing this group. So then we don't need to take education into account in something like the ACE because it's just not having a big enough effect. But if you were using the ACE, the Bengali ACE on people with 3 or 4 years of education, then it's going to have a massive potential influence. And that has an impact for normative data. So thinking about obviously our traditional norms, where we might split people into sex or age bands and then education bands. Well, if we did that, it would be impossible to do that with just, we think we've got a good sample of 305, but if we split it down, we'd end up with these tiny numbers in each cell. So the approach that we use is a regression-based norm. So a regression-based approach is where that you take into account factors that influence performance. So that could be age, it could be sex, it could be education. We also actually include education squared because of the nature of the regression equation. And then what you do is you determine what somebody's predicted score is. what they're based on the regression model that you build, and then you look at that actual score and you look at the discrepancy between that score. And that discrepancy then gives you an indication of how unusual or abnormal that discrepancy is. And to save people having to do the calculations by hand, we have an Excel sheet that allows us to do it automatically. So you just plug in somebody's score, and then their education and their age and their gender, and then you get a T-score at the end from which you can interpret in terms of how far away they are from being usual. So to finish off, in a sense, to accurately assess everyone who needs a neuropsychological assessment, it requires a deep understanding of the factors that can influence test performance. And a person's cultural or linguistic background is, of course, one of the many factors that can influence test performance. So it's therefore necessary to develop cultural competence in relation to neuropsychological assessment, actually in administering the tests, of which you have so much experience here. But there are many things that we can do to improve the validity of the tests that we're using. And I think there's still much to learn about the factors that actually underlie performance differences associated with different cultural difference. But thinking about the tests that we use is an important start. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, Aparna's prompted me to talk about... I guess that one of the points where she's talking about the Poppadom test. So a few years ago, one of the challenges, obviously, for a lot of these tests, including the Addenbrooke's, were including things like clock drawing. So for people with very low levels of education or who are illiterate, who may not be good at dealing with numbers or even using a pen and pencil. So our approach then was to try and identify what might work for people in that context. Could we develop something that would assess the same cognitive constructs that something like clock drawing does? So clock drawing is good because it has a bit of planning, a bit of spatial, a bit of problem solving and construction and so on. So we came up with the idea of what became known as the pizza or Poppadom test. So we have it's a circle of paper, and you have to imagine that this circle is a pizza or a Poppadom, depending on where you are, and we want you to fold and tear this into 6 equal slices, so as if you're going to share it amongst 6 people. And then we have a scoring criteria, and we've shown that particular approach was actually in people that could do both clock drawing and the Poppadom test. It had equal sort of sensitivity and specificity to the clock drawing. So it may be a useful tool for people that are not able to deal with pen and paper.